makes me feel thankful today that they actually fought that hard for rights.
Do you say that because it makes you think of the way it might be if they hadn't fought that hard?
Like we would be in that same position, trying to fight for our future.
Mainly in the South.
Question actually. Every time I learn about the Civil Rights Movement, every time I see a documentary or learn about it in school when they bring it back up during February, Black History Month, they don't really talk about this event. We hear the Rosa Parks, all of them are important and pivotal, but they never really talk about this. I don't know why.
Yeah, that's a good question. Why do you think? Why does anybody think?
I think that just like they had their schools, and then they had to make their own
Freedom schools.
Yeah, exactly. Freedom schools. They had to make their own freedom schools. I think all of our schools we're only taught what they want to teach us. Right? We're not taught the actual full extent of our Black history still, even now. So I think that's why.
I feel
most of it's cherry picking by now, right? Like if they kind of pick the most prominent leaders of their time, but there's a lot of other ones, a lot of subgroups and sub communities who also did something really huge, but you really don't hear about it.
Behind the scenes sort of. Which was what I mean.
I feel like in a way they're trying to make us forget about the fact that slavery and everything happened. Like they'll tell us like a little bit of information, but they just like want to forget about it. Like I don't know how to really say it, but it's like they're covering it up in a way. Yeah.
Yes, it's true. America doesn't want to remember slavery.
When I lived in South Carolina, you see how they had the Confederate flag. But even though when I was down there, the biggest issue that everybody had in the community was that the State House had a Confederate flag or under the state flag. And a lot of people were writing letters and petitions to get it taken down. And they took it down, but then they put it in the front with lights shining on it afterwards. So I guess that subculture's still there. You know, a lot of them say it's history, which it is. They can't get too mad because the South was the Confederate side of the Civil War, but at the same time, people thought it had too much hatred behind the sign, so they really didn't want to get it. Yeah. Put lights on it, I guess.
I mean, this question of what you're taught in school, I think, is a really important question. You're lucky now because you're living in a time when information is accessible, more accessible than ever before in history. However, you have to have some sort of consciousness and a lot of initiative to go beyond what you're taught in school and to get information in any subject, in history, in science, in math, literature. It doesn't matter, beyond what you're taught in school, because it is cherry-picked. And there's sort of a common story that I guess the establishment, you would say, likes to tell about America, the story that America likes to tell itself, about itself. And it doesn't like to look at slavery, although slavery is in America's DNA. So much of the problems that the country faces today, so many of the problems, can be traced back to the fact that slavery really was part of America's DNA. It is a part of America's DNA, but America doesn't want to look at it. America wants to sort of
forget about it.
Yeah, wants to forget about it.
Thinking out of the box is kind of like history is like a circle, and it just keeps going around and around, because even now it feels like we're modern slaves.
How so?
Because it's like you have the justice system kind of set up to only target colored people, like in New York, stop and frisk. And, You have colleges that it's really like we can only really get in if we have like scholarships or something like that. Like we could pay, but it's like how many blacks do you know that are really gonna be able to be successful with paying their whole way through colleges without student loans?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Have you heard, people talk about the school to prison pipeline? Have you heard that? You've heard people talk about that?
Oh.
What have they said? What do you know?
From elementary.
They said like they start off in like 3rd grade, like kids that can't read, like they build prisons, prison cells for them in the future.
Yeah. I remember watching that.
Right, they determine how many prison beds they're going to need based on 3rd grade reading scores.
And I think like the prisons correct me if I'm wrong, I think the prisons get paid off the how many African Americans will get placed in prison, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's been this whole move to privatize prisons. I don't know, maybe in the last 15 or 20 years before, prisons weren't private institutions, they were public institutions that were run by the government. Now they're private, so it means that, you want to have a business, you want to have a corner store, you want to have a shoe store, you want to have, whatever kind of money-making enterprise. And so prisons are now private institutions. People run prisons for profit.
Okay.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I missed it.
No,
I said that's crazy.
Oh, yeah.
The thing I questioned the most throughout the video was like, what gave your father the bravery to be able to go where other people wouldn't? Like it said in the video that he would go walking around talking to people throughout their houses that people would be scared to go through or wouldn't want to go to try to even enforce the fact to make a group that would try to fight against the people. And like, even though they got like the door shut in their face by multiple people, they still continue to go. Whether or not they had a few people behind their back, they still said they were going to Mississippi to fight for what right. Like
What gave him the bravery?
Yeah, that's like the main thing.
That's a question.
Yeah.
I don't know. You could ask him one day. I'm sure he'd be really happy to come and talk to you guys. I think that he's from New York. He was born and raised in New York. He wasn't from the South, but he went to Mississippi because when the kids started sitting in, the college students started doing the sit-ins. So you learn about the sit-ins usually, right? In Black History Month. He said they looked like he felt. And so something in him just clicked and he decided to go south. And I think there were people, I think just history is deep and long, and so, every once in a while these times come around where there's a cause that's so critical in that time that you just decide to give your life to it. And so I think for him and for the rest of the SNCC workers, that it wasn't that many, there were maybe like 30 of them. He was the oldest, and he was younger than Kesson is now. He was, y'all are 16, 15, 16, 17. They were your age. Like, all the organizers that they interviewed, they're now old people, they're in their 60s. They were your age. And they spent, that's all they did for 4 years, from 1960 to 1964. Freedom Summer, 24/7, 7 days a week. That's what they did. And they just decided, I don't know, I haven't experienced that, but they gave their life to it. And so then, once you make that choice, then everything else follows, You have to keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and things happen, right? The violence, the fear escalates, and it goes in ebbs and flows, but you're committed. You know? And for many of them, it was a lifelong decision, and even after, you know, that time period ended, but for most of them, their whole life has somehow been related to freedom work.
As a young girl, looking at your father, what was going through your head?
When I was a child?
Seeing your father, like, did he give you inspiration to do anything? Did he
When I was a
inspire you to
child?
do
Like how old?
any age?
Any age? So, I mean, he was inspiring to me as, I mean, he was my dad. I didn't have any sense of him as a historical figure until high school, really. And I still really didn't, even through high school, you know, I started to understand it, but probably not until I got to college did I really, really understand it. So, you know, as a child, he was just my dad, and he would do things that, you know, your parents do things, and you don't always like what your parents do. But he was always, you know, he's always been a really serious person and focused and dedicated. Part of the reason the Algebra Project exists is because, and the Young People's Project exists, is because he decided that he was going to teach us math. So he made us do math almost every day after school and in the summers, and he did that all the way through elementary school. So you sort of go back to what you said about, like, they just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, never stopped. He sort of has that quality. I don't know if he had that before he went to Mississippi, but, you know, like, he never gave up on the math. I guess the first time, so back to your question, I think when I was 10, that was the first time I went to Mississippi, and we went down for Amzie Moore's funeral. So Amzie Moore, I can't remember, they probably talked about it maybe earlier on in the film. Amzie Moore was an NAACP leader in Mississippi, and he had been in Mississippi as an NAACP leader for years. He had gone and fought in World War II, so in the 40s, and he, you know, steadily organizing from through the 40s, 50s, 60s. And that's sort of the other thing about movements. Like, movements are constantly, people are constantly working, but then you have some times when everything erupts. Right, so in this country, everything erupted from 1960 to 64, but hundreds of people, like your point about history and who were the history makers and who gets held up as a history maker, you know, people who you'll never hear about dedicated their lives to the freedom struggle. And because they did, something like Freedom Summer could happen, right? But we went to Amzie Moore's funeral, and Amzie Moore was the person who said that in Mississippi you can't do the sit-ins and you can't do the freedom rides. You have to do voter registration. Because in Mississippi they would just, like, lock you up in jail and turn the key, and you would just stay in jail forever. And so the thing about the sit-ins and the freedom rides was that you would do this as a act of civil disobedience, and then you get arrested, and then you get let out of jail, right? But in Mississippi, they weren't going to let you out of jail. However, because of, I think it was the 1958 Voting Rights Act, so there was 1965, they talked about that, right? And I think 1958, and we have to, like, go back and look at it, you couldn't imprison somebody for voter registration work, right? And so because they were working on voter registration, if they got put in jail, the federal government could intervene and say to the state government, you can't keep them locked up. You have to let them out. And so Amzie Moore was the person who said, in Mississippi, you have to work on voter registration. So we went down to his funeral, and I was 10, and it was such a big deal. And we took a train from Cambridge down to Mississippi. I don't know, we took like 2 or 3 trains. We had to go through Chicago and then down probably on Amtrak. And we got there, and I guess they had asked my dad if he would speak at the funeral, and I didn't have any clue about who he was. So I learned 2 things. I guess that was one moment that I was my eyes sort of opened up a little bit to who he was. So when he spoke, everybody got so quiet, and it was like they were waiting to hear him speak. And so I was like, oh, well, this, who is he? It was like for the first time, I became aware of him as being somebody other than my dad. And then he asked everybody to say the 23rd Psalm with him and to repeat the 23rd Psalm after him. And everybody did, and I was really surprised because I'd never seen him speak in front of a group of people, and the fact that he would ask them to do something and they would actually listen to him, that was sort of eye-opening for me. And then also I didn't know that he knew the 23rd Psalm. Like, we didn't go to church. I think we probably did have a Bible, but by that time he had sort of gotten into yoga, and so he would read to me stories about yoga, but he never, connected. I had no idea that he knew anything about the Bible and the 23rd Psalm. So that was my first childhood experience where I started to get a sense of who he was.
What is the connection between Freedom Summer and YPP?
So there are a lot of connections. One connection is Fannie Lou Hamer. So do you remember, what was your takeaway from the film about Fannie Lou Hamer?
I feel like she was probably a very essential part of the whole movement, actually, because I don't remember the specifics.
Oh, after, it's okay.
But when she was giving that whole speech, and when she finished, Lyndon B. Johnson went off stage, and he just announced the 9th anniversary of Kennedy's death or whatever, and he basically just ignored the whole plan. But the fact that she did that and it was publicized so much, I feel like that was a big help to the movement. Yeah. And she was a good motivator.
What else was your takeaway about Fannie Lou Hamer?
I was gonna say that they actually said in the movie that her speeches were sometimes even more powerful than other famous people who were fighting in the thing. Because she lived through a lot of the things she was talking about. She lived through the sharecropping experiences. She knew about what it was like to be abused violently by the white people, and so she was able to formulate a more compelling type of speech to motivate the people. Yeah.
Right. She was actually connected.
Right. Exactly. Does anybody want to add to that? So that's it. That's the connection, basically, between Freedom Summer and YPP. Because what they learned in Freedom Summer, what they learned through the movement was exactly that that you can have people who have power because of their position, right? Lyndon Johnson had power because of his position, being the president. Fannie Lou Hamer had another power because she was able to articulate her experience and to move people because she had lived through what she was talking about. And what they learned in Mississippi was that for the country to move around like big fundamental issues like this, it requires people who are living the experience to claim their power, essentially. And so the big issue for this generation is education. And education is related to, as we talked about earlier, it's related to the huge numbers, education and work combined, the huge numbers of people who are now in prison. But the people who are living through all the issues in education are you all. Right? There are other people who have power. You have the Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan. Right? But he's not experiencing what you're experiencing in schools. He can't speak to your experience with the same kind of power that Fannie Lou Hamer could speak to her experience. And so just like eventually it took the sharecroppers, the Fannie Lou Hamers, to stand up and say, and to fight and to struggle for their rights. We believe that at some point it's going to take students in the same way. For education to change, it's going to require for students and young people to stand up and struggle for their right to a quality education. And so YPP exists because when my dad started the Algebra Project, which was an organization to organize schools and teachers to ensure that all kids got access to the high quality math, right? So that math wasn't a barrier to success. And we can talk a little bit more about math and relationship between math literacy and social and economic participation in this society. But so when he created the Algebra Project, after a number of years, as the young people in the Algebra Project started to mature, he wanted to create a space that was led and owned by young people to determine what role they wanted to play in the movement and in the struggle. And so the YPP is its own organization. It's not like a wing of the Algebra Project. And YPP got started actually by 8th graders. They were 8th graders at the time. And my brothers and some of their friends and family who were in their early 20s. They were like 21, 22, 23. And so instead of having them be a program or organization that was ultimately like led and controlled by adults, the idea was to create the space for young people to have their own thing. Right? And so we've been doing this math literacy work for like 15 years. And it's amazing work. I mean, you saw one of the people at the end talk about how powerful it was to have meaningful work, right? And working in Mississippi was really meaningful work. Math literacy work is really meaningful work. And it does something, I think, for the soul and for the spirit to have meaningful work. Like the kinds of job opportunities that you have are mostly like fast food, retail stores. What other kinds of job opportunities do you have? That's mostly it. Yeah, that's it. But so this is a job opportunity. And in doing this job, you're going to improve your own academics. You're going to improve your leadership skills. You're going to help somebody, right? You're going to help each other, and you're going to help younger kids. And so it's meaningful in that way. It's also meaningful because, like, this is our legacy. We grow out of this history. We're directly connected to this history. And so there's a larger social justice vision and mission. And so it's meaningful in that way if you choose to embrace it.
We talked about how kids are influenced easily. Like, if you were to tell them that, like, 5 + 7 = 38, they'll believe it, and then they'll say it, and then they'll keep saying it. But the message is that we're making a change through math. But when they grow older and they become teenagers and they have a thought of their own, who's to say that their thought won't get changed? Because I know plenty of people who are getting straight A's and B's in schools, and one thing happened and they went down the wrong way. I'm just saying that because I don't think that it's just math, but I think that there's other things that we have to do or stop in order for us to succeed.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Can you give more examples of those kinds of things?
Like black on black crime. And the reason why that's happening is because there's not enough jobs, or people can't get jobs, or people are struggling because their moms or their father is gone. Just like we were saying, and that's where the inspiration comes. But I think there's more to it, like the media, like rap is very gang influenced, and it's saying a different message now. Rap isn't poetry anymore. It's just words. And young kids aren't going to understand that. They're just going to listen to it and be like, oh, I want to do that. They're missing the message.
Yeah, you have to have your own mind. And
my sister.
you think it's your sister?
She's looking for you? Someone's gonna pick you up?
Yeah, so it's good to be.
She's screaming your name?
Yeah, someone could be on the 6, I don't know what time it is.
Alright, go downstairs and check. Make sure to let her in. Come on. Just don't lock yourself out the front. I want to respond to a little bit of that. I think you're right on. Like Maisha said, I think that a part of what we do think about some of those things. We understand math is a deterrent for us and what we're doing. I was one of the first people that the program started with. But also some of the things we think about and focus on when I challenged everyone, like last night, to get their parents to talk to them. Communication amongst our people and our parents. That's a big piece of it too. And that was a challenge to y'all last night, just to see how y'all communicate at home. What's the messages that we're sharing with our families? And you think about what's the deterrent. Cliff, make sure you come tomorrow at 3:30. What's the message and what's going on and where we're losing each other is the communication aspect of it. You think about the black on black crime, you think about the drug selling, you think about the people that can't get the jobs. It starts with education. We talked about the critical prison pipeline, the feeder system. So if you didn't take necessarily as a young man in 3rd grade, and now you're sophomores and juniors, you didn't take reading and writing seriously, think about where you're struggling at right now. Those things weren't brought to the light in terms of my mom or your mom